Got my revenge after the neighbor beat his wife and made a false police report against me. 10 years ago, I lived next door to this guy named Brett, who is a complete piece of garbage. Like the kind of person you just know is bad news from day one. Our houses weren't even townhouses, they were totally separate, but you could still hear the screaming and yelling coming from his place at night. It started maybe 2 months after they moved in. My girlfriend Lisa and I would be watching TV and suddenly we'd hear shouting, then crashing sounds, then this woman screaming. The first time it happened, I called the cops immediately. They showed up, talked to everyone, and left. Nothing changed. It kept happening. Every few weeks, we'd hear the same thing. I called the police like 4 or 5 times over the next few months. Each time they'd show up, nothing would happen, and a few weeks later, it would start again. One day, I was outside mowing my lawn when Brett's wife came out to get the mail. Her name was Sarah. She had these massive bruises all up and down her left arm, like someone had grabbed her really hard, and there was this gnarly cut on her leg that looked infected. I asked if she was okay. She just kind of looked at me with these tired eyes and said she fell. But I'd been an EMT in the Air Force for 6 years. I knew what abuse looked like. That cut on her leg was from going through glass. Over the next month, Sarah started coming over to our house sometimes after the fights. She'd knock on our door at like 11 at night and ask if she could stay on our couch. I'd patch her up with my trauma bag I kept from my military days. One time she had 3 cracked ribs. Another time her eye was swollen shut. I kept asking her to call the police, to press charges, to do something, but she always said the same thing. Brett was a mortician at the biggest funeral home in town, and he had a ton of friends who were cops. She said it wouldn't go her way if she reported him. Here's where it gets worse. I used to open carry a pistol when I was outside working in my yard. It was completely legal where we lived. Just a Glock 19 and a holster on my hip. I never pointed it at anyone or even touched it around other people. It was just there. One afternoon, I'm at work and Lisa calls me freaking out. She says a sheriff's deputy is at our door with papers. I rushed home and this deputy hands me a restraining order. Apparently Brett had filed a police report saying I threatened him with my gun 3 days earlier. The restraining order was going to force me to move out of my own house. I was completely shocked. I hadn't even spoken to Brett in weeks. And here's the thing. I sold that Glock to a cop friend named Mike about a month before the supposed threat even happened. Mike was dating Lisa's friend, who was a social worker. I called him up immediately and explained what was going on. Mike was pissed. He asked me some questions about the report and then said he'd handle it. The next day, Mike showed up at Brett's house in uniform with a printed photo of my old Glock. He put a ruler next to it in the photo like it was evidence. He knocked on Brett's door and asked him if this was the gun I threatened him with. Brett said yes. Then Mike asked if the date on the police report was correct. Brett said yes again. That's when Mike told him he was being served with a ticket for filing a false police report. Because Mike had bought that exact gun from me a month before the date, Brett claimed I threatened him. Mike had the receipt, the transfer paperwork, everything. Brett's face apparently went white. The restraining order was thrown out immediately. I was in the clear, but Brett wasn't done. A few days later, I'm taking out the trash and he walks over to the fence. He starts making all these vague threats about how I better watch myself and how this wasn't over. I just stood there and didn't say anything because I knew something he didn't. I'd just gotten my discharge from the Air Force. Lisa and I were moving back east in 2 weeks, and I had a plan. 3 days before we moved, I went to this garden center and bought a shoot of bamboo. Not the decorative kind, the invasive running kind that spreads like crazy and is basically impossible to kill. I cut it into like 20 pieces that were each about 4 inches long. Then at 2 in the morning, I hopped Brett's back fence with a rubber mallet. I spent an hour randomly driving those bamboo pieces all over his backyard, under bushes, along the fence line, in the middle of his grass, everywhere. That same week, I also drove Sarah to a women's shelter 2 towns over. She finally agreed to leave him, and I made sure she got somewhere safe where he couldn't find her. We moved east, and I didn't think about Brett for a few months. Then my old neighbor across the street sent me a photo. Brett's entire backyard was completely overrun with bamboo. It had spread to like every corner of his yard. He'd apparently spent thousands of dollars trying to get rid of it, but it just kept coming back. That bamboo is still there. It basically destroyed his yard. And every time I think about it, I smile, because that piece of garbage deserved way worse than some invasive plants.